This exciting episode, Pete Mallory is unsure whether or not he can afford to keep his rented Alice Chalmers construction equipment long enough to complete his access road ahead of schedule. If that plot point doesn't get your blood boiling, perhaps the story of a surveyor with crippling fear will. I heard they cut the scene in which a city registrar collected property information because it was too graphic. It's Perry Mason, Season 4, Episode 21, The Case of the Difficult Detour. Welcome to the Perry Pod. I'm your humble host, Jonathan Searcy. My purpose, pretty simple, provide an audio companion to every episode of television's greatest legal drama, Perry Mason. Each episode, we give you a summary of the plot. We even compare plots with the Earl Stanley Gardner novel, if the episode was an adaptation. We give you a little trivia, reveal the episode's theme, and revel in a Perry proverb. That's a pearl of wisdom from the man himself. Before heading to the water cooler where, just like Perry, Della, and Paul, we can discuss the ins and outs of our fave legal cruise adventures. But first, say it with me, to the law library! Each time we visit the law library, we discuss a legal conundrum from Perry's case that helps us set future courtroom precedents. This episode, we talk about trespassing. Construction company owner Pete Mallory is working on an access road when all of a sudden he finds himself confronted by the cops.
Well, Mr. Mallory, it seems you've been trespassing.
Trespassing?
Mr. Ames is the owner of the west sections of land up to the high water mark on the lake. He claims your road and your equipment both are on his private property.
Well, there must be some mistake.
Easy, Pete, easy.
The case has a pretty easy conclusion. The survey that Pete appealed to was in error. He was trespassing on the property of Jim Ames. The plaintiff said knock it off, and Pete had to take his rented construction toys and go home. But what would it have taken for Pete to get charged with criminal trespassing? First, trespassing as a criminal offense is a misdemeanor, according to California Penal Code Section 602. Second, it is the culmination of a series of wrongdoings by the defendant that end up in punishment. Initially, whoever the criminal charged is gets a warning, told to desist. Then, if Mr. Mallory continued to work on Mr. Ames's land and damaged property, or when asked to leave refused, intentionally entered the property without permission, clearly ignored property markings, that refusal to cease trespassing would demonstrate willful violation. As a misdemeanor, he can get up to a year in jail, a $1,000 fine, or both. Stay off that property, Pete! Now, let's get to the plot of this episode. The Case of the Difficult Detour. Pete Mallory, Chet Stark, they're working hard on an access road, and let me tell you, the highs and lows are so close in this biz, it can make you want to cry. Tell us the good, Chet.
Well, Mr. Mallory, on your very first contract with your own company, I'm pleased to inform you that the access road will be completed a day and a half ahead of schedule.
Stuart Benton promises the boys lifetime passes at Bentonville Park. Yay? But then Sergeant Ben Landro shows up with some bad news. Turns out our boy Pete Mallory is financially leveraged to the hilt. No margins over here. His connection with the rental equipment, played by human spark plug Bert Freed, can't give Pete an extension. Pete doesn't have cash from Stuart Benton until he finishes his gig. He can't finish the gig with Jim Ames's property in the way. Stuart Benton tells Pete it's fine, but Mrs. Benton's mugging in the background signals to the audience that we should only trust Stuart Benton as far as we can throw him. In court, the judge rules in favor of Jim Ames, played by Neil Hamilton. Benton further brushes off an already distraught Pete. Ames, on the other hand, has a recommendation for a lawyer.
Mr. Mallory, I'm sorry. I realize how financially embarrassing the court's decision must be for you.
Embarrassing. Mr. Ames, I'm just about wiped out.
I just wanted you to know there was nothing personal about this where you're concerned.
Benton wouldn't have bought that north side from your daughter without an easy access road around the lake.
You appear to me to be the innocent bystander who's being hurt. What you need is an attorney of your own.
It's just got to be a mistake somewhere.
There's a man named Perry Mason. He isn't my attorney, but he's a friend and coming to my house tonight. Now, if you would like me to arrange an introduction, I'd be very happy to.
Back at the office and in conversation with Chet, Pete makes a startling discovery. The map's been forged! And we make another discovery when Pete drives away. And Chet calls Mrs. Benton?
Bentonville Park.
Sheila? Chet. Yeah, the worm has finally turned. Pete knows. He just exploded out of here.
Pete goes brutal on will-o'-the-wisp surveyor Phil Edwards. When Edwards calls Mrs. Benton to tell her Pete Mallory's a-comin', she plays it off, leaves the house. That sets up what seems like a 15th consecutive scene where a camera is positioned on the floor, shooting up at the bottom of the jaw of every character we get. This time a tete-a-tete between Pete and Stuart.
Look, Pete, before you say anything.
Quiet! No more talk. You've kidded me long enough with talk.
I'll make it good, boy. I'll give you back every cent, I promise. Pete, don't lose your temper.
Pete! Pete!
Next thing we know, Mrs. Benton shows up at Sergeant Landro's office looking a mess, saying Stuart's been going domestic. And when they drive out to the trailer together, they find a dead man. Surprise, surprise. Chet knows about it and passes on the news to Pete.
Chet, we're all washed up here. Let's pack and get out.
Get out after what happened?
What are you talking about?
Stuart Benton was murdered tonight. Beaten to death.
Pete goes looking for Perry, who's talking art and daughters with his pal Jim Ames. Pete asks for help. Perry asks Jim Ames for approval.
The victim was Stuart Benton. Evidently, he was killed between 9:30 and 10 o'clock this evening.
I see. Mallory, Benton, my land, and my daughters, yes, there would be an involvement.
You're a good friend, Jim. But you understand if I do represent Mallory, my first duty would be to him.
With Jim Ames' say-so, Perry goes to work. He gets Paul and Della in on the action. Perry, he's trying to corner Mrs. Benton, but ends up getting Harry Parker instead. Della, she finds Miriam Ames and uncovers some extra info about what brought Jim Ames back from San Francisco in the first place. And then Paul goes after Chet and uncovers his connection to Mrs. Benton. When Perry catches up with Sheila in a hotel room, she reveals the truth about Stuart.
We only wanted to stop Stu's cheating, his pushing people around, his double dealing. Oh, look, you didn't really know what he was like. His sweet talking women and his hoodwinking businessmen. He was a con man.
None of this prevents Pete from going to court for murder. Hamilton Berger calls Sergeant Landro, Harry Parker, Chet Edwards, and Sheila Benton to the stand. And that sets up this confession from Pete when the court recesses.
Happened a long time ago, San Diego. I hit a man. Too hard. They arrested me. Spent a couple of nights in jail. Benton had the records. I suppose he could have embarrassed me, but he didn't need to pressure me into doing that project. I wanted to do it.
Back in court, we discover that Pete wasn't the only one getting blackmailed by Benton. There was Miriam Ames.
Well, Miriam was happy and excited. She had no reason to suspect Stuart Benton was anything but what he claimed. So she went ahead and signed the land deal without letting me or an attorney even see the papers.
And then?
His wife showed up in town.
He had fooled her, swindled her, Shamed her in her own eyes, but he didn't stop there, did he?
Then there was frightened surveyor Phil Edwards. Guess who committed the crime?
And you were outside when Mallory hit Benton? And when Mallory left, you went inside?
Benton was half unconscious. The briefcase was on the floor. It wasn't enough just to get rid of the evidence. Mallory knew. I had to discredit him. And Benton could always talk. That could mean losing my license. Going to jail. Don't you see, Mr. Mason? I was frightened.
In our denouement, Pete joins the Ames family to discuss the future of Bentonville Park.
You know, Jim, permitting that access road to cross your property would get Pete out of a bad hole. But it would also allow you to have a substantial interest in a profitable venture.
Now, let's get trivial, shall we? Each episode in our trivia section, I give you 3 takeaways. A Paul is a subject worth investigating more. Adela is a deep dive on an actor or actress who guest starred in the episode. And finally, a Perry is something we learn about our intrepid hero. Our Paul for this episode involves art. So Miriam Ames has a distinctive touch, it seems, in her artwork. Her father, Jim, and Perry discuss it.
It's a great technique. Florentine, isn't it? Mm-hmm. She has a wonderful touch.
Our Paul prompt. What exactly is a Florentine touch? Let us know what you find, Pauls. Our Della for this episode is Suzanne Lloyd, a.k.a. Sheila Benton.
I'm sorry, but you had the wrong number.
Here's 10 about Suzanne. Number 1, born 1934, Toronto, Canada. Number 2, attended Pasadena Junior College, just missed being a candidate for Rose Bowl Queen. Leaves school after a year. Number 3, by the time 1960 rolls around, she's already appeared opposite 120 leading men, according to a Hollywood article. She dishes on those men. James Arness giggles. Dan Daly, the most fun guy in Hollywood. Mike Connors, long eyelashes. Marlon Brando, just a normal kind of guy. Dennis Weaver, he could be Brando if the studios just let him loose. Number 4, 2 famous TV roles. 1, the cat lady who haunts the dreams of Richard Conte in the Twilight Zone episode Perchance to Dream. And number 5, her other famous role, Raquel, in Zorro. Number 6, she married director Alan Buckhantz in the 1950s, but was divorced in short order. Then she wed composer and music maestro Buddy Bregman in 1961. The two of them were vegetarians for health reasons. A random fact I found, there wasn't a whole lot out there on Suzanne. They remained married until 1998. Number 7, Lloyd moved to Europe in the early 60s and was largely out of the movie biz by the 1970s. Number 8, she had one daughter with Bregman, an actress named Tracy, who is probably best known for appearing in over 1,700 episodes of The Bold and the Beautiful. Number 9, Suzanne died in 2017. And number 10, just because it was so fun, here are 3 more quotations from that 1960 article where she dishes on all sorts of leading men. Ray Milland, he's the epitome of all sophisticates. Richard Conte, he's a wild one. And Clint Eastwood, a bull in a china shop, but a lot of fun. Finally, our Perry for this episode involves Perry's penchant for striking bargains. Listen to this deal Perry makes with Miriam Ames.
Miriam promised one for my apartment, and I promised her $2,500 for her favorite charity.
Apparently, art is in the eye of the beholder, everybody. The theme for this episode is fear. It's difficult when your margins are razor thin not to break out in a cold sweat at the slightest hiccup. And then when your temper's got a hair trigger, that doesn't help things much. You get scared. You get embarrassed. You get frightened. And then Phil Edwards, well, we've never seen terror like this. A backstory about getting out of World War II combat because his fear was so crippling? Eesh. And of course, he externalizes that terror as violence and commits murder. There's lots to be scared about in Perryland. Con artists like Benton, inept DAs like Berger. But Perry's around, Phil, come on. Speaking of which, that's as good an intro as any to this episode's Perry Proverb. Perry has a heart-to-heart with Pete after the court recess. Pete confesses he's gotten angry. He spent some time in jail before for assaulting a man. And here is how Perry responds.
Tell you what, Pete. I won't let it worry me if it doesn't worry you. Good enough?
I gotta tell you, this is what every client wants to hear from their lawyer, especially after what feels like a confession that might damn a client in the lawyer's eyes. And of course, Perry rewards the trust Pete has put in him by solving the crime in the very next scene. Way to go, Perry! Now it's time to grab a swig from the water cooler.
No, there is one thing I don't understand.
Go on, Paul.
Each episode in the water cooler, I give you deleted scenes, outtakes from the script that didn't make the episode's final cut. Number 1, Della shows off all of the monogrammed items she has in her collection. There's DS on skirts and shoes and glasses and handkerchiefs and purses and towels, pillowcases, letterhead, her eye contacts, her car. Deleted scene 2. Emboldened by Perry's reaction to his confession, Pete offers more hitherto unknown information about himself until Perry finally has to say, I don't care if you feel okay about it. I don't feel good about it anymore myself. When Pete finally confesses that he forgets to feed his own pet. And deleted scene number 3. Miriam Ames and Pete end up together. Painting, construction. He builds houses, she decorates them. What's not to like? Can they get along in the suburbs? Our Paul from last episode concerned Paul's automobiles. On the ground in Pinion City, Paul's rocking a Buick instead of his traditional Ford. We asked, was that Buick an upgrade or a downgrade? My dad sent in the ultimate guide. Quote, to determine if it was an upgrade for Paul to opt for the 1961 Buick Electra versus the 1961 Ford Thunderbird, I used what the respective cars sold for in that year. The Thunderbird, base price, $4,170 to $4,445 if it was loaded well over $5,000. The Electra, between $3,820 and $4,350. Based on this, Paul was not tooling around in an upgrade when he was behind the wheel of the Buick. Assuming he obtained the car in Pinion City, a Thunderbird may not have been an option. As an aside, here is the market value of those cars today. The Thunderbird, average asking price at classiccars.com, around $21,000 to $47,000 based on 15 listings. The Electra, average sale value $25,900, high $72,000. Data based on 19 recent auction sales. Assuming the Thunderbirds sell for their asking price, this isn't a scientifically valid comparison, but anecdotally, the Buick today would be an upgrade from the Thunderbird. End quote. Thanks, Daddy-O. Now it's time to hear a listener letter. David Thorpe, our pod's resident gem expert, wrote a fantastic email on the case of the blind man's bluff. Quote, while we must initially set aside the absolute ridiculousness of there being a bucket of precious stone dust just sitting around the office, or that there would even be an amount of gem dust so big as that would quantify a major gem cutting center, there are definitely some gems that fluoresce under black-gray light. Ruby is one of the most notable. Also, diamonds do. Not all diamonds do it, though. It used to be a factor in diamond pricing, as they thought it affected the color of the diamond. Recently, though, the powers that be have determined that a stone's fluorescence has no effect on its color or refractivity, so although it is noted on certificates, it no longer affects pricing. The really fascinating thing about it is that we don't yet know why they do it. Now, different stones trend, and in the 1940s, there were definitely jewelers who experimented with alternative minerals, some of which do fluoresce, like apatite or opals, so maybe some of those materials could be mixed in, but it's more likely to be diamond dust. So if the pail was filled with diamond tailings, again ridiculous, then it is possible that it could be seen under blacklight. I like it as a narrative trick anyway. Another note on the episode, Miss Allison's wardrobe, a gem-studded dress she wears in the opening scenes. Awesome. I thought it was a diamond belt at first, but later in court, she had sweet pearls. They don't make them like that anymore, coupled with that amazing hat. That was glorious. End quote. Thanks so much for that email, David. I love it when someone's expertise intersects with the world of Perry Mason. If you have a comment about this episode or the pod in general, please send it on to theperrypod@gmail.com. In our next episode, in the zoo, the mighty zoo, the lion mews. Tonight, we're not in Oz anymore. It's the case of the Cowardly Lion. Join us, won't you? Until then, this is Jonathan Searcy saying, keep on walking that Park Avenue beat.